Oh, what was that?
Some bad feedback. You know, it's
Oh, great.
actually easiest and when you're doing a presentation if everyone stays muted until you want to ask a question or we have some discussion, and it avoids that kind of feedback. Even if you're on your phone, right, you can mute your phone as well. All right, any other questions before we move on?
So yes, Richard, I just started the recording, so we'll catch the rest of the talk.
Okay,
Okay.
I'll
Oh,
start
so
over.
you're recording it, David?
Yeah, it's going up to the cloud.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so the second part that I want to introduce here is say, okay, if we've talked about faith and how foundational and central that is for the Christian life, how about then culture? Right? Culture can be really misunderstood, and some people say that faith doesn't have anything to do with culture. And actually, Martin Luther was one of those guys. I'm not intending to pick on him, but just to introduce somebody who does kind of put a rupture between faith and culture. He says that faith is solely supernatural. It doesn't involve our nature, and it doesn't even involve kind of the visible elements of life, right? And so Martin Luther was a dualist. He drove a wedge between what we believe and then our life in the world. So culture, the reason why I want to talk about it in relation to faith, it is how we live concretely our daily life. And so a basic definition of culture is our way of life, especially our shared way of life with other people. And so this can really include just all the practices in my life and my family and in society that shape how I live. And so one of my favorite writers is the historian Christopher Dawson. He was basically his whole project, and he wrote a history of basically entire human civilization, was that faith, that religion is the very heart of culture. That is, it guides everything that we do, because just like faith, it gives us the biggest orientation about how we should live, what ultimately matters. But Dawson said we could think about culture being made up of a group of people living in a particular place, a particular environment, and then creating social practices through work and other organizations, right, to kind of shape a way of life in that environment that is ultimately guided about what we believe about life, right? So a particular people in a particular place who through their work, right, shape a way of life that is guided by what we ultimately believe. And he said that we live in the first secular culture in human history, that essentially our culture has ripped the heart out of human life. And that doesn't mean, however, that we don't still have religious beliefs, right? Because secularism has become a kind of religion in our culture. That secularism does have ultimate beliefs, right? That the point of life is what? Well, health and safety, right? And we see that coming out even in our recent crisis. That if you are a materialist, well, then health and safety become the biggest factors. Or personal pleasure, right? Personal autonomy. The way that we understand freedom, even in a secular culture, can be very religious. That is, it's a belief about what's ultimately important. So our culture tries to marginalize religion to make it something that's a matter of personal opinion, but it still has beliefs, and they're clearly beliefs, right? They're assertions about what really matters and how we should organize our life. Ultimately, we should see that culture is a union of cult, culture, and cultivation. That's how it was traditionally understood, even by somebody like Cicero. The word culture actually comes from the Latin word colere. And colere is the word for cultivation, like agriculture. Agriculture, you can see the word culture is in agriculture. Colere means to cultivate. But the participle, like of the word colere, is cultus. And so it's fascinating that in the ancient world, cultivation and worship come from the exact same word, colere, right? So to cultivate a field and to worship the gods came from the exact same verb. And so in the ancient world, our lives were not separated in that dualistic way. Everything was bound up together. And so culture, cultivation, what does that mean? That's actually something that Peter Marin, he's one of the co-founders of the Catholic Worker Movement with Dorothy Day, he said culture, cultivation should be our focus. That means worship is the most important thing that we do. Okay, I can actually mute people. So if I get feedback from people, I actually will just mute you because I am getting some feedback. So cult is the center of culture. What we worship, what we think is ultimately important, actually gives us the orientation for everything else, as I was saying with faith. And then culture, the culture cultivation is education. How we pass on what we believe to other people. So that we see that particularly in education. So we worship what we ultimately believe in. We pass that on to other people through culture, that is through education. And then we work this out in cultivation. All of them come from, once again, the same word in the classical world. And so our belief is passed on to other people through the church and through schools. And then we find our vocation of how we live this out, how we cultivate things through our work in cultivation. All of them come from, once again, the same source. And John Paul II said that culture is necessary for our full development as human beings. He said we can't be fully human without culture. Why? Well, it's because, like Aristotle said, we are social beings. We are not individual beings. I think in the modern world, we like to think we are, right? That we're autonomous. But we depend upon other people. And this dependence is at the heart of culture, that we need to work together with people in our family and with people in our society to work for goods that we share. And just like we need the family to educate us, we need our schools to educate us, and we need even our work to make our own contribution in society. These are all ways in which culture develops who we are. So faith gives us the ultimate orientation about our eternal destiny, but culture is actually this way of life that helps us to live the way that we should right now. And it's like our second nature, right? So we're born as human beings with our nature, and then we're born into a culture as our second nature that teaches us how to live in the world. The way that we think, our habits, everything is shaped by our culture, which is why I think John Paul said that culture is so essential. Okay, so that's the second piece, faith, culture being more oriented towards how we live this complete way of life in the world right now. And then I'm going to link them, but before I do that, I'm just going to stop once again and ask for any questions. So at this point, I just muted everyone. So if you want to ask a question, you have to unmute yourself. So you just click on that.
Dr. Staudt?
Yes.
This is Deacon Norm.
Hi.
Hi. So based on what you're telling us about culture and Pope John Paul II, is the church counter culture in the way it makes its decisions, the way it approaches community?
Yeah, it's a difficult question because in some ways it even depends upon the country, right? If you look at like Spain and Italy, priests teach in the public schools in those countries to everyone, right? You can opt out of it, but the priests actually teach in all the schools there. But I would say that, like, obviously the church was born into a hostile culture in the ancient world, and the Romans wanted to stamp out the church, right? So the church was underground. And the church came out of the underground and actually had to rebuild culture in the West, right? And so Saint Benedict is one of the great founders of the West as we know it. And so Western civilization is really a combination of the legacy of the ancient world and the church receiving that and converting the barbarians and building up this new culture in the Middle Ages. And so Western Christendom in the Middle Ages was a culture with faith at its center, right? And so it's the highest expression of Christian culture that we've seen. But through the Reformation, this kind of rebellion of Northern Europe against the church, and it was a political rebellion just as much as there was a religious rebellion. And then you had the French Revolution and all these other revolutions. The church was really pitted against modern culture, right? Modern culture grew up in opposition to the church through the Reformation, the French Revolution, and then even things that followed, like the Communist Revolution later on. All of these things were pitting the church against modern culture. And Vatican II basically was like a timeout that said, okay, stop. We don't want, to be in opposition to modern culture. We don't just want to be in our ivory tower condemning the modern world. We want to engage the modern world. We want to dialogue with the modern world and re-evangelize the modern world. So Paul VI and John Paul II both said that the purpose of Vatican II was to evangelize the modern world. And so those were two popes really central to the council, and that's what they thought happened. It should have happened, right? But what do we see in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and even still going on today? We're still working that out. So if we've gone from opposition, in some ways we've gone to accommodation of the culture now. And we can see that, right? People want to change the church's teaching to make it more palatable to the modern world. But what happens? Nobody takes that seriously, because the church from the beginning has power as a sign of contradiction. Now, the church has been saying that we need to enculturate the faith. What does that mean? And that's something that the church has done even when the church was underground. It is expressing faith through culture. And so this is getting into my next point a little bit here, but the church always has to use culture to express itself. Even John did this in his gospel. In the beginning was the Logos. That's enculturation, right? Logos is a Greek concept. And so John was engaging Greek culture when he was explaining who Jesus is. Or, of course, another famous example is Paul at the Areopagus in Athens. He's actually quoting the poet Pindar, the Greek poet Pindar. And so the church from the very beginning has been engaging culture and using it to express faith. But in doing that, it also has to heal and purify the culture as well. And so, like when Paul went to Ephesus, there was a riot because one of the idol makers says, this guy's going to put me out of business, right? And so you can see there's a tension with the culture. And in Ephesus, they said, these guys are turning the world upside down. And so you can quote Pindar even as you're turning the world upside down. And if the church is not turning the world upside down, it's kind of like, then who needs it, right? And so the church always has to challenge us to break from the culture where it's in contradiction to faith. And on the other hand, because we live in the culture, the church has to use the culture to communicate to us and to express faith. And art is one of the key ways in which the church uses culture. So if you look at the catacombs, the symbols in the catacombs are ancient symbols. And sometimes, even pagan symbols like Orpheus. Orpheus went to the underworld to try to bring his wife back from the dead. And so the early Christians used that as a symbol of the resurrection. I mean, that's pretty bold, right? Where we can even use pagan symbols to express the Christian faith. But there's a danger in that, right? And if our culture right now, right, what is our culture right now worshiping? Well, human freedom and sexuality. Can the church redeem that? Absolutely. But could people, in trying to redeem modern understandings of freedom and sexuality, give in to those distorted understandings? Yeah, there's examples all around us of Christians and Catholics who are giving in to a distorted understanding of human freedom and conscience and sexuality. So this is really, I mean, this brings us to the heart of the topic of faith and culture, why it's so important. We can get it really wrong, but when we get it right, it's very powerful.
Doctor, I have a question on history.
Yeah.
It's my opinion, or in some readings that I've done, that the Western history that we learned is really a revisionist history that comes from the Protestant Reformation to downplay the church's positive role in the 2,000 years since Christ. If that is true, if you agree with that, does that exacerbate the problem between culture and our evangelization?
Absolutely, it does. No, I totally agree. The word or the words Middle Ages are actually pejorative. You know, all that stuff that came in between the ancient world, right? The ancient world was glorious, and we're going to rebuild a glorious world in the modern world. And then there's that Christian stuff in between. So even the way we talk about the Middle Ages is absolutely characterized by what you're describing.
Yeah, they weren't dark.
Well, I mean, there was a dark period after the fall of Rome, right? So originally, the person who coined the term the Dark Ages was the Renaissance writer Petrarch. He said all that stuff was dark in the Middle Ages, and he was wrong. But today we generally say the Dark Ages are from the fall of Rome to Charlemagne in the year 800, when there was political chaos.
Okay.
But in those 300 years, the church laid the foundations for the rebirth of civilization. And there's a lot of ways we can see that. Even the fact that the church preserved classical writing and philosophy and transmitted it to those barbarians, right, and civilized them. And the church preserved Roman law and gave it to those barbarians, right? So we can see that the church was the rebuilder of civilization. I actually read an article just yesterday about how atheists, and one of them is actually Richard Dawkins, who changed his mind. There's a bunch of atheists who have actually now recognized that Christianity has given us the values that we really cherish right now. Like, you can't even imagine human freedom and dignity in our culture right now without the Middle Ages, right? Because the Middle Ages is the civilization that enshrined those values, or even the equal dignity of women. Where does that come from? Christian culture, right? Because there was no sense in which women had any rights at all in ancient civilization. Even in Greece and Rome, women didn't have any political rights. How did women get political rights? It was in the Middle Ages, you know? So even atheists now, including Richard Dawkins, he has actually now said, okay, I now see Christianity as a force of good. As you probably know, I'm the book reviewer for the Denver Catholic, and I actually just got a book written by an atheist called Dominion, which is an argument for how Christianity has given us the values that we cherish, which I just said. And so I'm excited to read that, because it's actually an atheist defense of the Middle Ages as building up modern culture, right? But you're right, Deacon, it's not the narrative that we've learned. But John Paul actually said that Christianity is a builder of culture at its core. That's a bold claim. He basically said, what does the church do? The church builds culture. And that's actually where I want to go next. But before I do that, I'm happy to take any other questions about culture. I don't want to cut off discussion. I love discussion. So.
Okay, so a question is, we've seen this movement through history from, or through the culture towards Christianity. What do you think is now causing the world's movement away from Christianity and the goods that we've given to the world?
Mm-hmm. Well, we are being told, and this goes back to Deacon Richard's point, that Christianity is a force that contradicts human freedom and dignity, which is a lie, of course, right? And it wants to restrict us. And one of the ways that you see it wanting to restrict us is in our sexuality. And this is even why abortion is such a sticking point. Nancy Pelosi, who claims to be a Catholic, right, said that abortion is a sacrament. Whoa! I mean, but what does that mean? To me, it means that there is, as Dawson said, another religion that we are up against. And this religion even has sacraments. It has a creed. And Pope Benedict, you know, there's a new biography of him that just came out in German that has an interview at the end. And it's going to be translated in the fall in English. But in this interview, Benedict actually said there's a new creed. And if you don't believe in this new creed, you become excommunicated in our culture. So there's a new creed, there's new sacraments like abortion. And if you don't fall in line, there will be persecution. And we're already starting to see examples, right, of this new persecution of people who don't believe in this secularist creed that we have in our culture. So I think that, you know, we don't need to be fatalists, right? The church reconverted the West, right? These barbarian tribes who came in, who were actually heretics, right? Most of them were Arian heretics who didn't believe in the divinity of Christ. And the church rebuilt civilization. And so I think John Paul wants to tell us we can do that again, right? And I'm even going to go through some practical points about how we can try to do that again by building from the foundations back up, right? But we don't have to be pessimists, but on the other hand, we need to be realists to say that as we tried to rebuild a Christian culture, there are other people who want to build a culture that excludes Christianity because it sees it as fundamentally hostile to the project that they're trying to build. And if we look at some of the biggest threats, it's a new understanding of human beings, right? Because right now we have the ability to tinker with human genetics. And Google is already working on projects to use artificial intelligence. People always talk about like robots outside of us. That's not where artificial intelligence is going. Where it's going is putting that technology here so that we are actually facing this kind of transhumanist threat that wants to actually remake what it means to be a human being. That's what we are going to have to face, I think, in the near future. And so we have to be very strong in living the Christian life to really fight this and to have a viable alternative and to guide people against, I think, these threats that we're going to be facing and are beginning to face already. Okay, so if we put these pieces together, right, so we have faith as the fundamental orientation of our life to God and to eternal life, to our true destiny. And that's even important in light of transhumanism, because what does transhumanism say? Our destiny is to make a more perfect humanity where we can overcome sickness and death and all of the limitations that we have. That's a utopian goal. And so we say a utopia on earth isn't good enough. What do we want? We want eternal life. And the point is that the Catholic faith sees eternal life as having to start now. This is how we bring faith and culture together, is that the way that we live has to be in accord with our faith. And I want to quote, I'm going to give you in just a few minutes here, I'm going to give you some time to read this 2 pages from John Paul. But in the second paragraph of my handout, I want to quote something right now. He says the synthesis between culture and faith is not just a demand of culture, but also of faith. And there's a reason for this. He has another famous quote that he says that without culture, faith cannot be faithful to itself. It cannot be fully lived. It cannot be fully consistent because faith has to become a culture, according to John Paul II. Faith, and this is where the modern world wants to restrict faith, right? Faith cannot just be my opinion. It cannot just be private. It cannot just be something I do on Sunday. The Christian faith demands a translation into my everyday life and everything that I do. And if I do not bring my faith in everything that I do, John Paul says that my faith cannot be then consistent and faithful to itself. There's a contradiction in who I am. And so this really becomes a question, and this even does bring us back to the early church. Will you worship Caesar or will you worship Christ, who is king? When the early church proclaimed that Jesus is Lord, what did that mean? Well, that was the title of Caesar. Caesar is Lord. Bishop Barron's been good at really pointing this out. Who is your ultimate Lord, Caesar or Christ? And we might not have a king, but we have these cultural claims today that do demand adherence. Are we going to be faithful to our culture that is going this direction, or are we going to be faithful to our faith that wants to take us this direction? And that split is a problem for the Christian. Pope Paul VI in Evangelii Nuntiandi said that the split between that the gospel and culture is the fundamental problem of the modern world. Right? And so John Paul really said that the new evangelization has to overcome that rupture that Paul VI was talking about, because we can't have a split identity. And I would say that, I mean, this is really a big problem for Christians in the world right now, is that even church-going Christians, right, people who are in the pews on Sunday, you say, yes, I'm Catholic. Yes, I believe what the church teaches, at least on some level, right? But then the rest of the week, they're following the culture, right? They're going to the movies and watching the new blockbuster, the new TV show that just came out. They're thinking the way that people think in the world, which is contradictory to the gospel in many ways. And so the new evangelization is trying to say that we need to live as Christians in the modern world. That it's not enough just to say you believe, but if you truly believe, this shapes your culture, this shapes your way of life. And so the new evangelization engages culture, I think, in two ways. Fundamentally, and this goes back to what we were saying, we do have to engage people where they're at, right? So people are living in this culture. They're thinking the way the culture thinks, and we have to acknowledge that. And so we have to be able to kind of reach out to them within the culture and find ways of communicating with them using the culture, right? Without giving into it, right? And it's kind of like, oh, geez, this is difficult. So without kind of selling out to the culture, we have to still engage the culture, because that's where most of our people are at. But then as we're engaging people and bringing them to a deeper faith, because that's our goal, right? Is that we have to engage people to bring them to a knowledge of Christ, this encounter with Christ, and to an adherence to Christ and faith. But if they have this encounter, well, what next? Then we have to help them to live stemming from that encounter. And so once again, this is where culture really comes in these two prongs. Engaging through the culture, that's enculturation, and I think it's very difficult to enculturate right now. And then leading people to a deeper way of life that is shaped by faith. Okay, so that's a little bit faster because I already brought out some of these points when we went answering the questions about culture. But that's why culture is so important for us right now, because faith requires it. And if we don't have a way of life shaped by faith, then there is a fundamental problem in our Christian life. Does that make sense to people? Are there any questions or comments about that?
Yeah, Deacon Norm again.
Yeah.
The question I have is that the struggles we have connecting the two cultures. I believe firmly that the seeds of faith, hope, and charity, and all the virtues are brought into each human being that is born into this world. Mm-hmm. And it's up to
reborn into this world, I would say.
That's right. Yeah, born into this world. And ultimately, it's cultivating that seed that eventually creates that, okay? And so the biggest struggle we have, I think, with the current church is judging and control. And again, that gets back to my original question about counterculture. Could you respond to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, this is why I started with faith. Because if we don't have faith, I think we have nothing. Faith, hope, and love are gifts that God give us. They're not part of our nature, right? What are the seeds? I mean, we actually, as intelligent beings who have a mind and who have a faculty of free choice, are able to enter into a relationship with God. But that relationship with God through the theological virtues is a free gift that he gives us and that we respond to in our freedom, helped by grace. But without faith, we have nothing, and I think Paul's very clear about that, because what do we have then? we're left in ourselves. We're left in our own sins. And so the deepest thing that we need is conversion. There cannot be a Christian way of life without conversion. Otherwise, we're left in our sins. And Christ didn't come to leave us in our sins, right? He came to save us. And so the church's primary job is to bring us to salvation. And if the church is not proposing the gift of salvation to us, then she is fundamentally letting go of her existence, the purpose of her existence, which is to bring us to everlasting life through this relationship with God. Now, what I'm trying to say is, if we're going to bring people to encounter with Christ, which I think we have to do much more, part of faith is then living out the faith. And so once again, I mean, if we're simply affirming people where they're at, then there's no point, in the church's life, right? The church doesn't exist to affirm people where they're at. We affirm people in that God created us good, okay, but we're all sinners, right? And so we're living apart from God. And so the purpose of the church is to say, God loves you. He wants to be in a relationship with you. To be in a relationship with you, you need faith. That is surrendering your own will and accepting the will of God in faith and entering into a relationship with him. And so that really is the core. But the thing is, what we can't do is say, hey, come and meet Jesus, and then you're on your own. Good luck. Good luck living as a disciple of Jesus in the modern world, which is hostile to Christ. And so that's where I think when John Paul is calling us to this cultural evangelization, he's really saying that we need to find ways to live faithfully in the modern world in a way that changes the modern world. Because he said that evangelization is not only a matter of proposing faith to people, but it's also a matter of changing the culture itself, to bring Christ to the culture. Right? And I think that's why John Paul is the great apostle of culture.
So hi, it's Deacon Jim. It's nice to see you again.
Yeah.
Are we saying here that, or is it kind of like the wheat and the weeds, where, we're growing up together, these two cultures, so to speak, we're intermingled. But don't we also have to have something there that's compelling for them to want to be part of this Christian community? Because if they're getting all their perceived needs met, right, if they think things are okay, if there's nothing compelling we're giving them, why should I join you?
Mm-hmm. And I think what's compelling, why the church exists, is to live in relation to Christ, right? So in a way, I think people in the modern world don't necessarily think that they need a savior. And so that's part of evangelization, is saying that you do need Christ, right? It's helping people to come to the place where they encounter Christ and see that he will heal their brokenness. Everyone is broken. G.K. Chesterton said original sin is the one doctrine that can be empirically proven. Why? Through human experience, right? We know that original sin exists, and we just have to help people to really, to bring their brokenness to Christ, to meet Christ. And then what really is Christian culture in my mind? It's then living with Christ. And I think the part of the problem is that people will come to the Catholic Church and not necessarily have that encounter, right? And so we need to say, how, when people come to the church, even our own faithful who may not have encountered Christ in a personal way, how do we help people to truly encounter Christ in our parish communities? And then how do we support them? If they really do encounter Christ in our parish, how do we then support them in living with Christ? So if somebody were to say, what really is Christian culture? I think it's simply living with Christ every day.
I'd like to disagree with you on one point when you say that the culture of secularism doesn't need a savior. I believe they have a savior.
Yeah.
And that is someone who's going to protect the environment. From people I've encountered, that seems to be the number one topic, protecting the earth and protecting the environment, and that's going to be our saving grace.
Yeah, but that's very telling. I don't disagree with that, but it's very telling because they're looking, once again, that modern utopia. What do they want? Health, safety, whether it's for us or for the environment, right? We need someone to protect the exterior elements of life. We want, material progress, whether it's environment, economy, health. So it's the exterior, and we neglect the interior. So a lot of people, we're now getting to the point of just religious indifference. If you look at some of the polls of young people, what do you think about God? I don't think about God, right? And that's what I'm saying. We need to awaken their conscious. We need to awaken their soul to the spiritual life and to the moral life in relation to Christ, right? That He can awaken the inner life for them. Okay, so what I'd actually like to do now is just take 5 minutes so we can just, once again, just kind of stay on mute and to take a quick look at the handout of Pope John Paul II on culture. I just think he has a powerful way of speaking of a lot of the themes that we've been discussing. And so I kind of want you just to hear it from the horse's mouth a little bit, right? I'm just trying to summarize some of his teaching, but this is a very succinct, I think, expression from this great apostle of culture himself. And so once again, it'll just take about 5 minutes. If you don't finish the whole thing, that's fine. I think you'll still get a good sense in 5 minutes. And then we'll just come back and discuss this. All right, just one more minute. Okay, so we'll just stop here. Even if you're not finished, that's fine, because I think the first page itself gives us a great overview. And reading through it, I was pretty happy. We had a good first 45 minutes because I think we really hit a lot of the key points that John Paul, I think, was making on the relationship of faith and culture. He's very clear, right, that faith needs culture, but he's equally clear that culture needs faith. He says that faith can heal culture. And I think that's crucial, right? Because our culture may have noble aspirations, right? I mean, even we were talking about the environment, right? We are meant to be stewards of the environment. God gave us that task at the very beginning. Catholic culture really is based on the fact that God said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it, right? And subduing doesn't mean destroying. It means that God is making us his own stewards. So could the church actually help the culture to know how to care for the environment in the right way? Could the church actually help the culture to understand what freedom really means and how freedom is meant to build us up and not destroy us? Can the church help culture to understand how sexuality is really something that is meant to fulfill us and to contribute to our happiness, once again, not to destroy us, as we do have, destructive expressions of sexuality in our culture right now. And does anything else really stand out to you from John Paul's lecture here?
Dr. Staudt, hi, it's AJ. Good to see you again.
Hi, good to see you.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think about our gospel for the ascension, this cycle, where Jesus says, "Go out and make disciples of all nations," right? And is if I'm understanding right, that's what he's bringing the faith to all the cultures, not just the Christian culture. But it just seemed to resonate with me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, the enculturation of the church it's not something that was just in Europe, right? But what I would say is that Europe maybe had the fullest expression for the longest period of time, right? For about 1,000 years. But, we can see enculturation in Ethiopia and in the Sudan, for instance, in Africa, right? You can see it in the Persian Empire, where Christians from Persia actually sent missionaries to China. And even in the 8th century, they were presenting the faith through Chinese culture all the way back then, right? And converted parts of India as well. So you can see enculturation in India. You can see a unique enculturation of the faith throughout Latin America. So AJ, I agree, right? I mean, this synthesis doesn't mean that, we're looking to the past, right? It's something creative and dynamic where we might build on our past legacy, because the Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome are very important touch points in terms of bringing together. What did Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome stand for? Jerusalem for faith and salvation. Athens for a philosophical understanding of the human person and human reason. And Rome for the order of society through law and justice and all of these things, right? And so there's a way in which every culture can learn from that enculturation in Europe, but it will look different in each particular culture. So there's this dynamic evangelization of culture that the church is called to.
Dr. Staudt, this is Deacon Ron. The last paragraph, there's a this is really important. The situation is also a tragedy for culture, which is undergoing a deep crisis because of the rupture with the faith. Now, we're talking something that was written 23 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
The symptom of this crisis is primarily the feeling of anguish, which comes from the awareness of finitude in a world without God, where one makes the ego an absolute and earthly affairs the only values of life. This has been exacerbated by the internet and the culture that we have with Twitter, and people can, I think it probably comes up during this crisis where many people are feeling suicidal, or many people are feeling that things will never be the same again. And the feeling of anguish, if people were more, if the culture and the faith work together, then people would have that hope. It's that there is some, people don't think about beyond what is today. And I'm not excluding myself, because many times I'm the same way. But and I wonder how that translates to the younger generation, which are getting the education from other sources other than a faith source in their own family.
Yeah, it's a huge question, because young people right now, I mean, you can just look at stats. Teen suicide is skyrocketing. Teen depression and anxiety is skyrocketing. Even the whole issue of transgenderism. Why all of a sudden are teenagers questioning their gender, in a way that's never happened before? Well, they're being prodded to do so, particularly, by the culture, but because of this internal restlessness, this anxiety, and this lack of hope, right, that comes out in that paragraph you just read for us. And so the need for evangelization, as I was saying, that Christ heals, that's who he is, right? I mean, he doesn't always heal us instantly, quickly, and easily, but that's who he is. He is a healer. He is a Lord, and he wants to reign over us in every aspect of our lives, right? And this is where the culture comes in, not just in our belief, right? Not just in our private moral life. He wants to reign over every part of our life. And that's what we want to bring our young people to really come into that freedom. That's freedom. But if you are detached from a sense of purpose and identity, then you fall into this destructive kind of anxiety and restlessness. And there's too much weight, right? You shouldn't have to figure out the purpose of your own life. We think that's freedom, but unfortunately, that's not what people are experiencing, right? If we say we're all about freedom, well, look around. Is that what we see? I mean, just look at our understanding of the impact of the addiction to pornography. I would say pornography is almost like another sacrament of our secularist culture, right? Is that, we don't want anyone to smoke a cigarette, but we're okay with people looking at pornography. But even from a medical point of view, pornography is much more devastating to your health. Not just your moral health, not just even psychological health is huge, but it just has a huge impact on your overall health, So once again, it's like we need to help liberate people from this terrible situation that they're in.
Deacon Norm again. A question for you is, I saw in the piece by John Paul II a challenge for us to include culture in our plans on the parish level. Could you give us some idea what that might look like?
Yes, and that's my goal in the last half an hour. And so, I always think like, gosh, I have an hour and a half on Zoom. It's like, oh, it's going to feel like eternity. And here's what happens. It always goes by in 1 second, right? And it's like, wait. We haven't talked about the plan yet, So that's actually where we're transitioning to. And so since we have just a half an hour left, we better move to that. I just made a comment in the chat box. So there's at the bottom of the Zoom box here, there's ... more. And if you click on that, you can see chat. And so my plan, I do have a pastoral plan when it comes to culture, is based on these 4 points. And so I want to give an overview of these 4 points, and then I'm hoping that we'll have some time to then discuss how this might be able to impact the parish. So I was thinking about maybe breaking up into small groups. I'll see if we have time. It just depends on how loquacious I am on this pastoral plan. So if I can do it in 20 minutes, I'm going to break us off for at least 5 minutes of smaller group discussion, then 5 minutes to kind of come back for any big conclusions. But once I said, like I said, you think like you have all this time and then it zips by. Okay. So I just posted my 4-point plan. Okay. 4 points. The first is that the way that we live, if Christian culture is a Christian way of life, then our way of life should be ordered around prayer. That's the base. A Christian culture should be a culture of prayer, because as I already mentioned, the encounter with Christ is at the heart of Christian culture. And prayer is how we encounter Christ every day. And so can we order our day around Christ? Can we order our week around Christ? That is, that Christ is truly given one day a week to be his day. Sunday is not actually the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day is Saturday. In the Italian language, the word Saturday is sabato, Sabbath, right? So the Jewish Sabbath is Saturday. We don't have a Jewish Sabbath. We have the Lord's day, a day that belongs to him for his glory and for the power of his resurrection to flow into our lives. That's a day of Christian culture, right? And I'm arguing that every day should be a day of Christian culture, but there's one day that particularly should belong to the Lord, and that is Sunday, the Lord's day. And once again, in Italian, right, it's Domenico, the Lord's. That's what Sunday means in Italian, the Lord's. So Sabbath is Saturday, and then Sunday is the Lord's day. And then the whole year is that when we live the liturgical year and we celebrate the feast days, when the feast days become big days for us and for our families and for our parishes, right? The big feast days should be cultural days for the parish, processions, fairs, music, dancing, whatever, good dancing, right? The traditional dancing. This is, what we really see coming out through prayer shaping how we live. And so I would just say how we spend time is crucial to how our life is shaped, right? And so that spending of time is crucial to put God at the center. Can God be the center of my day every day? That is, I wake up in the morning, and this is, I think, what we need to teach people in the parish. What do you do when you wake up? That shows your priority. Can you wake up in the morning and say, God, this day belongs to you. I put you first today, even just for 5 minutes. Everyone in your parish can pray for 5 minutes when they wake up. Everyone, right? And when you actually talk to people, I know you talk to people in the parish more than I do, but when I talk to people in the parish, a lot of them are intimidated by prayer. They don't know how to pray. And so I think we can say, when you wake up in the morning, this is what you say to God. God, I love you, right? I thank you for this new day. This day, I give it back to you. And please guide me this day, help me this day. And then, just read, a few verses of the Bible and sit in silence and think about it. So we might be pushing a little bit more than 5 minutes, but 5 to 10 minutes, and that can grow to become 15 minutes and from there. But, just say, hey, in the morning, before you get into the rat race, take a few minutes to give the day to God, to make him your priority that day. And you can tell people that will help you in everything you do that day. And then at the end of the day, can you gather your family together and pray a decade of the rosary to thank God for the blessings of that day? And, of course, we have a big tradition of the examination of conscience at the end of the day. Okay, everyone just stop and think. Are there things you need to say sorry to God for this day? Think about that, right? And then just commend yourself to God before you go to sleep. Those are the hinges of the day, the morning and the evening, right? And so the day turns. That's what we mean by the hinges. The day turns on those. And then from there, you continue to build out. Say, can you take another, 5, 10, 15 minutes during the day to stop? Once you get those hinges down, right, then you build from there. Can you stop during the day? And we can say, well, yeah, that's your prayer life. Yep. And that's Christian culture, because I'm living with Christ. How do I live with Christ? Well, first by prayer, and that roots me once again in my identity. If I am truly a disciple of Christ, if I am truly a son or daughter of the Father, then I have to live that, So we can say, yes, faith has to be the center of your way of life. Okay, that's nice. But this is where the rubber meets the road. And to say, well, if you're truly living the Christian life, then that will, come out in how you spend your time each day. And then, of course, this goes back to the Lord's Day, but the Eucharist is the heart of Christian culture, even in a material way, right? Culture is the cultivation of the goods of the earth, right, to shape how we live. That's where we go back to culture, cultivation, right? And so this cultivation, well, bread and wine don't, appear on their own. We have to cultivate them, right? So it's the works of human culture that we bring before God. And then he changes them. He transforms them into something supernatural. And so the works of culture are transformed into the supernatural. And in coming to receive the Eucharist, right, we have our deepest encounter with God and also with each other, right? It's the center of our own communion with God, communion with each other through this communion with God. And so the Eucharist is the highest point of Christian culture in so many ways, right? And it is, to use the example of, this is a good cultural example, right? J.R.R. Tolkien, the lembas, the way bread for the journey of the flat bread of the elves, right? And it's, even when you eat nothing else, it says the more you rely on it, the more strength it gives you, is what Tolkien says in The Lord of the Rings about this bread. And that's exactly what the Eucharist is. It's our way bread. And when we receive the Eucharist on Sunday, it should give us the strength to live the Christian life through that next week until we have this high point of the encounter with Christ again the next Lord's Day. Okay, so I could talk about that forever and ever, right? But that's point number one. Prayer is the center of Christian culture, especially the Eucharist. The second point is the mind and the imagination. Faith builds upon reason. This is the great Catholic principle that, once again, Martin Luther denied, right? He said that reason was the whore of Babylon. But for us, faith also depends upon a rightly ordered mind. If my mind is all over the place and it's focused on other things, it's not rightly ordered, well, then how can I really attend to the truth of the faith? How can I focus on faith, right? And so my mind has to be rightly ordered even to be able to enter into prayer. Because, some people say, well, I can't concentrate enough to read. But if you can't concentrate enough to read, it's going to be very hard to concentrate enough to pray. And so partly, and this goes back to that image of the wheat and the weeds, right, that was brought up. I think that this whole thing with the mind and the imagination is rooting out the weeds. But what are the weeds? Well, partly it's entertainment that contradicts faith. Right? This is where the imagination also comes in. The imagination is even the physical images that come into my mind based on my experience, the thoughts and images that I have that enable, even shape my creativity, right? So if I say I'm a good Catholic, but then I listen to music that focuses on destructive things, bad thoughts, bad images, right? If the media that I consume is carnal, right? Just in that sense that it's just, charging up my senses, my emotions, my passions, and it clouds out my mind, it's going to be hard for me to follow Christ, right? And look, pornography is an extreme example of that, but it's not just pornography, right? I'm just watching mindless entertainment for hours each day. Well, could you read the Bible? No. That's boring, right? And it's like, you have to cultivate the mind to make it good soil. The mind and the imagination have to be cultivated to be made good soil. And this is where the cult, right, is the first part, prayer. And this is where the culture comes in, the cultivation of the mind. That's what Cicero said education is, the cultivation of the mind. Education is more than just schooling. The deepest education comes from the family. And so how I spend my time, what I consume in terms of media and entertainment, will come largely from the habits that are formed within the family. And I hear this all the time from people. It's just a movie. It's just music. No, it is cultivating you. If you watch bad movies, right, that are focused on people fulfilling their passions or mindless entertainment, that's cultivating you. And that's something that we have to come to terms with. There's a great book, even when it comes to technology use in general, called The Shallows by Nicholas Carr. What does he mean by the shallows? The more that you focus on just scrolling through things on a computer or a phone, that your mind loses, only temporarily, that's the good news, but your mind temporarily at least loses the ability to focus on one thing deeply and to concentrate upon it. And so he says, even the way we read is like the letter F, scroll, drop, right? So he says it's like the letter F. You just scroll across and drop down. And so then it becomes hard. There's physical barriers, because in the book, he looks at how your brain becomes rewired through the habits of technology. Your brain becomes rewired to make it difficult to sit and to read like the Bible, or to sit in silence. Silence becomes difficult, right? You become anxious because you're used to this, jumping from one thing to the next. And so Cardinal Seurat's book, The Power of Silence, is a very important book, right? Because he claims that one of the deepest things that we need for a renewal of the spiritual life is to cultivate silence. Well, what do you need to cultivate silence? To break bad habits of technology. And so we need to build ourselves up. There's something called the Catholic imagination, which is a sacramental imagination, which sees the material world and images and sounds as things that become symbols of larger things, right? And so we tend to look at relationships, the environment, and even art as symbols for the truth, for goodness, and for beauty that should elevate us. So concrete things, eating, drinking, spending time talking to people, these are the sacramental realities that make up the Christian life, right? And this, in a way, is kind of blending into my next point on work and leisure and in relationships. Our leisure time should be focused on things that build us up, on good experiences. Like St. Paul says in Philippians 4, whatever is good, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is beautiful, whatever is pure, think on these things. Yes, right? Yes, And this is where the other handout I gave you is an expression of the Catholic imagination. Jared Manley Hopkins. In America, we just say Gerard, but he was British, so it's actually pronounced like my name, even though I have a different name. So Jared Manley Hopkins. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil, crushed. Why do men then not wreck his rod? Like the rod of the cross. They don't wreck the rod. Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, right? The earth itself, right? The sacramental vision of the earth is being covered over. And wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, oh, morning, at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with a warm breast and with bright wings. So it's a beautiful poem from Hopkins. What he's saying is that the world is sacramental. It's meant to point us to God, but we've kind of disfigured the world and we've kind of covered it over. But the deepest things are still there waiting to be drawn out. And the Holy Spirit is there to do it, to enlighten us, to illumine us, and to bring renewal. And this really, I'm going to use that then as the transition to my third point, is shaping the habits of work and leisure within the family particularly, but within even just our lives more broadly. How do we unlock even the hidden power of nature? What's wrong with our imagination, right? If we're covered over with technology and we're distracted and and the media is bad and kind of poisoning our minds in some ways, just the things that we consume, get outside. So this is where work in the traditional sense, like if you go back to Leo the 13th and Rerum Novarum, he says work is the way that we become co-creators with God, where we fulfill the mission that he's given us in Genesis 1 and 2. Even Adam tilling and protecting the garden. One of my favorite writers, John Senior, in his great work, The Restoration of Christian Culture, he says, sink your hands back into the soil. He says it'll be good for your health and good for your mind, you know. He says, don't watch football on TV. Go outside and throw the football around, right? He says, smash the TV and instead light a fire, sit down next to the piano, sing songs and read books together, right? And this is where it's these shared practices. And my third point, you know, I could describe it a lot of ways, but it's shared practices, taking a hike together, you know, gardening together, you know, spending time together as a family, making the family meal sacramental in that small sense, right? This of the sacramental imagination, where it's something we guard. You know, are we guarding our time together and our shared practices as a family? If the family's breaking up, it's because the family doesn't have shared work and activities to bind it together. The word economics means the law of the home, the law of the household. That's what economics means. And economics used to bind the family together. The family did things together. And so if we want to rebuild Christian culture in the family, and I do think the family is the number one place to begin rebuilding Christian culture, it means doing things as a family. And so maybe that means if under the second point of guarding our mind and our imagination and tilling them as good soil meant cutting out some bad things, well, maybe on the third point, we have to cut out good things. You know, maybe we can't do as many sports or can't do as many after-school activities, or maybe we have to prune things back to say that, especially on the Lord's Day, once a week, we're going, you know, on a hike together as a family so that we can be recharged and re-energized and spend time together. Or every day, unless it's an emergency, we are going to eat dinner together. And so sports have to be organized around that. And if there's a sport that would conflict with dinner, we're not going to do it, you know, to say because, and we're going to cook dinner together. We're going to clean up together. Right? We're going to do projects around the house or outside together, garden together, to make the house a living place of culture again. Because I think the family's suffering because it's lost its own unique culture. And this is where, once again, we're not simply spiritual beings. We're cultural beings, right? So we're body, mind, soul, and community, right? And so we have to attend to healing in all of these areas. Heal the mind and imagination by only giving them good things to eat, right? So, you know, we become what we eat, what we consume. And if the family's suffering, then we need to say, what are we doing to build up the family, right? And we need these shared practices. And culture and cultivation, this is where John Paul was saying we become more fully human through culture. All of us have this need and this desire to make things. We are cultural beings, right? And so this is where in the family, we need to express this ability to make things. I wrote a book about beer as an expression of Catholic culture. Everyone says, why do you write a book about beer? And I said, well, because I wanted to write a book about culture, but I didn't think anybody would read it, you know? So I used beer as an example, you know? But I was like, homebrewing is an example of the home economy, right? You don't have to just go to the store and make beer. You can make your own beer, you know? My kids helped me make beer, you know? But that's just one example. There are many things you can do as a family, right? To draw people together and to build up family culture. And that brings me to my last point then on community, right? One of the main points about culture is that it's a shared way of life. And if the family is one of the most important places to build it, it's also important to say that families are not sufficient in themselves. Families can't build a complete culture, right? But if that's the beginning, right? So the beginning is shaping my own life through prayer, but then I'm building upon that through my, you know, healing my mind and imagination. Then from there, I'm shaping these common practices with other people. The family is the best example, but it's not the only example, right? I'm shaping these shared practices, but then from there, I'm building up into the bigger community. Okay, now we're talking about actually building a bigger culture. Where's the next best place? It's the parish, because a parish is a community of families. It is a family of families, and the parish community is meant to be a family. The church is the household of God, right, according to St. Paul. So the church itself is a household, and therefore it has its own economics, right, the governing of the household. And so how can we build community through the parish? Because most of our parishes are too big to simply say, well, we have community done, right? A lot of people just want to come into the parish and go to mass and then leave and then come back for the sacraments, whatever. But if we're actually going to build a Christian culture, we have to say, how can we support the way of life of our parishioners? And so we need to start building communities of families through the parish. We need smaller groups supporting one another through the parish. But I think the parish can also become a place where many of these things happen, right? Where we're building up maybe prayer outside of the Mass through the parish, right? We're building up even the imagination, is that the parish becomes a place for experiencing good, wholesome cultural things through the parish, where maybe we're helping our parents to come across good literature. We're going to have a reading group of families. We're going to read C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia together, and then you're kind of building up, this broader culture within the parish. Or we're going to do a project together as families this weekend, or we're going to have a camping trip. We are going to have a true festival, not just the kind of moneymaker, festival, but we're going to have live music. We are going to have maybe like a traditional country type dance, like square dancing or English country dance. We're going to teach people how to do that. Holy Name, for instance, has done that, brought in somebody to teach people a traditional form of dance. We're going to have picnics where families, and I know that is more common. We're going to have picnics where families eat meals together and get to know one another. And all I'm saying is that I think the parish can be a cultural hub. And I think that the culture will change the more we're able to help families. And I don't want to say that everyone in our parish is part of, family, right? We do have, younger single people or older widowers or whatever, where they're not in the family context. But I'm just saying that I think we can help people to live a more robust way of life centered on faith. And so I guess I would just try to help parishes to think about that, right? We do have to strengthen evangelization because that's the center, right? But then how do we surround our efforts of evangelization and catechesis with ways of living out the faith in daily life? That's key, right? And so it's faith, it's relationships, it's practices. And I would even give one example of this. The sociologist Christian Smith at Notre Dame wrote a book called Young Catholic America. And he said that Catholic schooling and parish ministries, by and large, have no measurable impact on whether young Catholics will practice their faith into adulthood. That can be a terrifying stat, but he said, we studied young Catholics across America, and just going to youth ministry or Sunday school or even to a Catholic school doesn't necessarily mean you're just going to practice your faith in young adulthood. He said, but there are 3 factors that make it more likely than not that you will. One is mentorship by adults, so it's relationships. And you can also have, peer mentorship as well, but it's primarily mentorship from adults in the faith. And parents have to learn how to be mentors in the faith. That's part of this, right? We have to teach parents how to do these things that I'm talking about. Secondly, it's then coming to the parish for like CCD and youth ministry. They support the number one thing. And then the third thing is having practices to live out the faith in your daily life. That faith can't be something that's confined to Mass or confined to Sunday school or whatever. It has to be, I have friendships, I go on mission trips, I come to the parish to do things, I have other friendships that support this, and I'm living this out. I'm praying daily is one of the examples that Christian Smith gives for practices to live out the faith. So this is where I'm saying is that it's not enough, and it's actually proven that it's not enough just to focus on coming to Mass and education in itself. I think those stats from Christian Smith say that there has to be these practices to surround our faith to really make it stick, especially in a difficult cultural environment. Okay, so we have 5 minutes left just for any comments and questions about, once again, this having more of a plan for creating these practices within the parish to help individuals and families to live out the faith.
You are unmuted.
Well, this is not a question, Doctor. This is more of a comment. And I think your presentation has given me a lot to think about in terms of ministry, parish, personal life, and all that. And I just want to thank you for that.
Yeah, it's
And I
okay.
also want to comment that I think this is the best attendance we've had at a region meeting in a long time. Maybe Zoom is the way to go, Dave.
A lot of people are thinking that. It's just, geez, I don't know, maybe. I taught a 8-week class for teachers, school teachers through Zoom, and I'm like, gosh, maybe I can reach more teachers through Zoom now. I don't know, you know.
It definitely makes it easier for the retirees or maybe aren't as able to travel quite as easily.
Well, even the Catholic schools, we're looking at a hybrid in the fall if we need to, you know, to have in-person and online learning. So that's another way to consider it hybrid, you know.
I think your time, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I thought that your topic is, especially for these times, is really well done. And I appreciate you coming and agreeing to be with us today in these times, to give us those things to think about our culture, because we've all preached about it, I'm sure, and hopefully we live it to the best of our ability. But John Paul II, which coincided with Benedict XVI and now Pope Francis, all teach often about the new evangelization and how that helps our culture to become a better place to live in this world. It's through Jesus Christ that we all are we're saved. That's the basis of that. And in my last 8 weeks, probably like you, migrating to Zoom to complete my RCIA class, I haven't totally enjoyed that, but I've gotten used to it. I much prefer the in-class where I can see the people and understand what's going on a little better. If this is our new norm, then we have to figure out a way as ministers of the church to continue to help people come to Christ in a different format, perhaps in a different format, but to take that message as succinctly as we can give it to them and allow and help them to penetrate the world, their own world. You know, as one who was in the jails and prisons for 20 years, I used to say to the prisoners, if you change your world, the world has changed around you. If you don't, it won't be. So you need to be that light of Christ, and you need to continue to do that for your own self, if nothing else.
Yeah, I really agree, because, you know, when we talk about culture and the challenges of culture, it can just seem like, well, what can we do? There's nothing we can do. And, you know, when I teach about culture, I like to say, yeah, there is. And it really will have an impact.
Yep. Very good.
I'm going to just stop the recording at this point, but we can continue the discussion.